Hello and welcome to the Cato Institute. My name is Marian Tupi. I'm a policy analyst with the Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity, and I'm delighted that so many of you could turn out to hear Frank Dikotter and Harry Wu talk about China and communism and Chinese history, and maybe in the Q&A that will follow their presentations also about the way forward for the People's Republic. When I was preparing for today's forum, I saw one review of Frank Dikotter's previous book, which was entitled Mao's Great Famine, The History of China's Most Devastating Catastrophe, referred to the author as a revisionist and anti-communist. So welcome amongst friends. But more to the point, at a time when a giant poster of Mao continues to hang about the Tiananmen Square, when Mao's face continues to be on the Chinese banknotes, when one former Maoist presides over the European Commission, and when some American kids walk in the nation's capital wearing T-shirts emblazoned with hammer and sickle, without feeling least bit embarrassed, it seems to me that a little revisionism and anti-communism is exactly what is needed to remind us of the 45 million victims of the Great Leap Forward. I say victims of the Great Leap Forward and not of Chinese communism, because the Great Leap Forward was just one of the episodes of mind-boggling cruelty that the Chinese Communist Party inflicted on the Chinese people. While the first part of Frank Dikotter's planned trilogy of books dealt with Great Leap Forward, the second installment deals with the early years of the communist rule. In The Tragedy of Liberation, A History of the Chinese Revolution between 1945 and 1957, Dikotter draws on previously classified documents, secret police reports, and eyewitness accounts to tell a largely untold story of betrayal, self-abasement, imprisonment, and execution. In China, Dikotter writes, the story of liberation and the revolution that followed is one not of peace, liberty, and justice, but first and foremost a story of calculated terror and systemic violence. Frank has been a chair professor of humanities at the University of Hong Kong since 2006. Before coming to Hong Kong, he was the professor of modern history of China at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. He was born in the Netherlands, was educated in Switzerland, and graduated from the University of Geneva. After 2 years in the People's Republic of China, he moved to London, where he obtained a PhD in history from the School of Oriental and African Studies. He stayed at the school as British Academy postdoctoral fellow and as Wellcome Research Fellow before being promoted to a personal chair as Professor of Modern History in China in 2002. He has published 9 books that have changed the ways that historians view modern China, from the classics, The Discourse of Race in Modern China, to China Before Mao, The Age of Openness. Today, of course, we are privileged to launch here in Washington, D.C., his latest installment, The Tragedy of the Liberation. Please help me welcome Frank Dikotter.
I will speak for about 30 minutes. I will speak with a clip-on microphone. I don't like to stand in front of a microphone fixed like a giant spider. Let me start by thanking Marian Tupi for an extraordinarily generous introduction and for the invitation. What better place than the Cato Institute to talk about the very opposite of the values it cherishes, namely the systematic violence and calculated terror of the first years of the regime in China. I'm particularly honored because this is the Friedrich Hayek Auditorium. And then Hayek not written a book in 1947 called The Road to Freedom, The Road to Serfdom. That's very much the title that I would have used for this one. By 1956-57, that road road to serve them has been pretty much fully traveled in China. And that's the topic of the book. Let me talk about this very briefly. I'm hesitant to walk around as I normally do with a clip-on microphone because I know there is a camera on the back and that person will become very annoyed if I do so. They'll just stay here. But let me in about half an hour talk briefly about the key points of the book. In 2006, I read a newspaper article in which it was reported that construction workers in Chiang, a city all the way up north in China, in a region formerly known as Maturia, had made a ghastly discovery. They were digging, and in that rich black soil of Manchuria, they stumbled upon thousands of skeletons very closely packed together. The residents gathered around the excavated area and wondered, could these be the victims of the Japanese occupation of the city during the Second World War? One elderly man realized that they just stumbled upon the remnants of the Civil War. In 1948, the communist troops had laid siege to the city. Unable to defeat it, that starved it into submission. In the process, at least 160,000 civilians also starved to death. After decades of propaganda about the peaceful liberation of the People's Republic, few people remember the victims of the rise to power of the Chinese Communist Party. Let me step back. Why don't we start on the 6th of August, 1945. Hiroshima, erased in the blinding flash of light. 2 days later, Stalin declares war on Japan, keeping to a promise he'd made earlier to Roosevelt and Churchill at the Yalta Conference. The Americans gave him plenty of help to do so, at least 600 ships of land-based materials sent to Siberia. So even in the race to reach Berlin and occupy half of Europe, Stalin managed to keep his army in Siberia almost 1 million strong. Manchuria is occupied within days. But even after the capitulation of Japan, the Soviets do not leave. They stay on until April 1946. They hand over the countryside to Mao Zedong and his ragtag army of guerrilla fighters. They establish 16 military institutions. Some Chinese officers go to Moscow for advanced training. Logistical help arrives by train, by air, by sea. From North Korea alone, 2,000 wagon loads are allocated to the task. And in the meantime, the Americans become so disillusioned with the nationalists, and Chiang Kai-Shek in particular, that they stop their deliveries of armaments. In September 1946, Truman imposes an arms embargo. But Chiang Kai-Shek, rightly or wrongly, believes that he cannot possibly keep hold of China without controlling Manchuria. So he keeps on pouring his very best government troops into that region. And again, his best armies are defeated by Mao Zedong. As Mao Zedong has been able to turn that ragtag army into a formidable fighting machine involved in a war of attrition against the enemy, the nationalists. By 1948, the communist troops advanced towards Changchun, Lingyao, and circles the city. But when he realizes that the nationalist garrison stationed inside will not capitulate, he orders the city to be starved into submission. 160,000 people die. Zhang Zhenglong, a lieutenant of the People's Liberation Army who later on documented the siege, compared it to Hiroshima. He said Hiroshima took 9 seconds, Changchun took 5 months. but the number of victims was pretty much the same, 160,000 civilians. Once Changchun is gone, other cities are besieged. Beijing, unwilling to undergo the same fate, surrenders. One after the other, cities tumble from Beijing all the way south to Canton or Guangzhou. By the end of 1949, the nationalists flee to Taiwan, never to return. What happens with liberation? Well, in every town conquered by the People's Liberation Army, liberation is celebrated with a very carefully choreographed procession. Soldiers open the parade, followed by a truck with a portrait of Mao Zedong, and dancers waving red flags, moving their bodies to the music played by heavy waist drums, gongs, trumpets. It's a fanfare. After the celebrations, come the police. They are less friendly. Within cities like Beijing, Shanghai, special teams trained to take over public security arrive within days of liberation. But on the whole, whether it's in the police station or the post office, city hall, government servants, civil servants, are asked by the communists to stay on and help the new regime. After all, they can't run a country of that size. Well, the police, who stay on, do the rounds, and try to ferret out forbidden items, which range from radios to weapons. But most of all, they classify everybody in these cities and assign them a class label, a Shengfan. There are bad classes, revolutionary soldiers, good classes, revolutionary soldiers, factory workers, middle classes, intellectuals, and bad classes. These encompass capitalists and landlords. All of them are asked to go and transform themselves into new people in schools. All of them have to learn the new ideology. From Beijing all the way south to Guangzhou, cities become giant adult education centers. Except for a few at the very bottom of the hierarchy. Paupers, prostitutes, beggars, also millions of refugees and disbanded soldiers are sent to the countryside, which becomes the great dumping ground of all undesirable elements. Some of these cities, bustling Shanghai, for instance, become pale shadows of their former selves. Foreigners leave in droves. Shanghai, which at that time was half again as big as Moscow, had a larger foreign population than any city on planet Earth except for New York, and more foreign investment than either Paris or London. It becomes a dying city within months. Unemployment rockets, international trade comes to a halt, shops shutter at 6 in the evening, curfew is imposed. Further up north, Tianjin also slips into slow decay. But how about the countryside? I've talked about the cities. Let us go back to the countryside, where liberation very much starts with something that has been referred to as land reform, quote unquote. It starts very much in Maturia in 1947. It's done round about 1952 at the very latest. Some places undergo the process of land reform twice. Let me focus on one small village called Yuanbao, all the way north of Manchuria. 1947, special teams arrive into this village of 700 people. They try to find out what the power structure is. Who are the elected village leaders? Who are the people who carry credibility? And bit by bit, they try to pent up local grievances and polarize this village into two opposites. A majority, the people, and the carefully targeted number of victims referred to as landlords, tyrants, traitors. After months of very patient work, the militia arrive, seal up the village. Everybody has to wear a strip of cloth. The poor, or those labeled poor, wear a red strip of cloth. Those seen to be landlords have to wear a white piece of cloth. These victims are rounded up into cowsheds, one by one. They're dragged out onto a stage, struggled by the farmers, assembled in their hundreds, mocked, humiliated, denounced, and eventually killed. Some 73 people in this village of 700 are violently killed. Their assets distributed to the others. The land paced, measured, distributed, furniture lugged away, grain loaded into baskets, pigs driven along. Nobody here has the opportunity to somehow stand back on the sidelines. Farmers who do not participate in these violent denunciation meetings are themselves denounced as people who are shielding landlords. Mao manages to compel everybody to denounce each other. The result is that in this village and elsewhere, everybody has blood on their hands. The pact between the poor and the party is sealed in blood. Enough blood must be shed in order for a return to the old regime to become impossible. Violence is intrinsic to this revolution. It is not a byproduct. The villagers themselves have to get rid of their own leaders. Yuan Bo was very violent, but take Hebei, where a whole county is bloodied, according to Liu Shaoqi himself, who writes in 1947 that people are being dismembered, buried alive. Xi Zhongxun, father of a man referred to today as Mr. Xi, he runs the country, I believe, reports from Shanxi that even the children of people labeled as landlords are persecuted as little landlords. How many victims? Very difficult to say, but by 1952, 10 million people have been expropriated. 40% of the land has changed hands. Some 1.5 to 2 million people have died violently in the process. Might people be allowed to get on with it? By the end of 1950 or so, 1 year after liberation? Not quite. On the 18th, of October 1950, some 200,000 troops cross into Korea and start fighting the American troops a few days later. Mao uses the Korean War as a pretext to regiment his own society. He launches a campaign of terror. He has a directive in which he says that counter-revolutionaries, spies, bandits, remnant nationalist troops must be liquidated. And how is he going to do that? Well, by steel production and grain output, death came very much with a quota mandated from above. The chairman believed that 1 per 1,000 in the entire population should be publicly executed. But of course, he's not alone. Before you know it, there are willing executioners on the ground, trying to outdo each other, comparing how many people they kill, and sometimes afraid of being seen as lagging behind. Villages compete with villages, counties and counties. By 1950 and 51, in a province like Guizhou, up to 3 per 1,000 people are being killed. And then ordinary people themselves, in a very fractured society, use the terror to settle their own accounts, to pursue their own personal vendettas. Take one example, or two. The first one from Yanqing County in Yunnan, a wealthy region covered in salt fields, where on the basis of one anonymous denunciation that reaches the headquarters of the party, over 100 school children are arrested in 1951. Wu Lianying, aged 10, is hung from a beam, and he's beaten. Ma Siye, aged 8, has his knees crushed on the concrete floor. A 6-year-old is accused of being the head of a spying squad. 2 of these students are tortured to death. You might think, well, that seems exaggerated. But this is the beauty of the party archives, in which I have worked to come up with the evidence for this book. There's profuse, detailed evidence about what happened. Reports by the secret police, bean counters, to add up how many people were killed, investigations, you name it. So this was not an isolated example, not far away from where I live in Hong Kong. Across the border in Guangdong province is a Luoding county where 340 school children were arrested on the mere suspicion of one case of theft. In that entire province, up to 1/3 of all the people killed during this campaign of terror, up to 1/3 of all those victims are judged at the time by the regime to be innocent according to their own standards. And then something else is happening. On the cover of these public executions, which are supposed to reflect the wrath of the people, verdicts are given by people's tribunals in cities. People have to attend them in stadiums, in the countryside, the public village square. They must witness these executions. But under cover of all that, local cadres pursue their own little personal vendettas. People are killed secretly, covertly, along their embankments, along rivers, near ravines, deep inside the forest. In one town called Maobong in Sichuan, some 10 people are officially denounced as counter-revolutionaries, shot in public. Over 100 are covertly assassinated. How many? Very difficult to say, but when this campaign of terror comes to an end in October 1951, according to one report, which the Minister of Public Security wrote himself and sent to Mao Zedong, the total reaches 301,800 for a mere 6 provinces. Bo Yibo, father of another man we've heard of recently, Bo Xilai, puts the number of people killed during that campaign at roughly 2 million. So now we are at the end of 1951. Might this be the end of the terror? Might this be the start of an era of peace and social stability? Again, not quite. Mao Zedong turns his attention towards the very ranks of the party itself. He believes that there are local cadres who have become corrupt. Many cases are discovered as cadres turn against each other and start denouncing themselves. 2 high-ranking party officials are executed in Hebei. They're shot in the heart, not in the head, as a concession to their rank. But something else is happening on the cover of popular support for a few highly publicized cases of corruption within the party. All those civil servants, government employees, who had been asked to stay on by the communists in 1949 and even promised the protection and gratitude of the party, are no longer needed. A good million of them are quietly dismissed, many of them sent to the Gulag. And even before this campaign against corruption in the party has ended, Mao shifts his attention again towards another group of people. Already in January 1952, there are dark hints about malevolent, evil outside forces undermining public morality. It's not that cadres are corrupt, they've been made corrupt. Mao Zedong says that the bourgeoisie has been waging a savage offensive, quote unquote, against the party. But entrepreneurs, businessmen are already reeling from 3 years of communism. Everything that stood between them and the state has already been eliminated. But it's not enough. So the very techniques fine-tuned during land reform are now being replicated inside factories and enterprises in the cities. As managers, business people, shopkeepers are dragged out one after the other, made to confront the workers, assembled to denounce them. Some of these entrepreneurs turn against each other, driven by sheer fear, trying to save themselves. Again, no adequate numbers, but in Shanghai alone, some 644 people commit suicide within 2 months alone. That's about 10 a day. If you try to jump from windows, but the police have erected nets around some of these skyscrapers, so they go all the way up to the roof and take running jumps. Again, we will not know how many victims there are, but this campaign is also followed by something else. An attempt at thought reform. Because all those so-called middle classes, those intellectuals and professionals, have to declare their loyalty to the party. We're only in 1952. I still have to talk a little bit about what happens from 1953 to 1957. We don't have much time. So let me focus on 2 key events that take place. Both of them triggered by events in Moscow. The first one you can guess. It happens in March 1953. The old man himself dies. Stalin is gone. But Stalin was the only one person powerful enough to somehow restrain Mao. The Stalin would urge him to be a little bit easier on those rich farmers in 1949 and 50. It was Stalin who had told Mao to slow down the pace of collectivization in 1952. Now that his master in Moscow was gone, Mao could forge ahead with collectivization. Already by the end of 1953, the party imposes a monopoly on the grain, which means, in effect, that the villagers have to sell the grain they produce to the state at state-mandated prices in state-managed shops. A year and a half later, Zhou Enlai, enlightened as ever, imposes an internal passport system derived from the Soviet Union and referred to as the household registration system onto farmers in the countryside, meaning that they are now tied to the land. They cannot leave these collectives and try to find work elsewhere in the city. And by 1955 and 56, giant state farms have appeared. So that many, but not all, of these farmers have become, in effect, bonded servants of the state, serfs. The road to serfdom has been fully traveled for many of them. The land belongs to the state, not to them. Their tools are to be shared. Their work schedules determined by local cadres who decide who should do what for how many work points. Same thing in the cities. Our commerce and industry by early 1956 have become functions of the state, from small shopkeepers to larger industrialists who were promised also protection against interference by the party, have to hand over their assets to the state. Many do so with a big smile, because they realize that that's their only chance to actually keep a job in what is now state-owned and once belonged to that. There is, by 1956, massive discontent. And this we know because of a second event triggered by Moscow. This one happens in February 1956, when Khrushchev denounces his former master, Stalin, for having presided over a regime of suspicion, fear, terror. Khrushchev even denounces the state farms that Stalin had imposed on the farmers. Mao sees it as a personal affront. He, after all, is, if not the new Stalin, certainly the Stalin of China. Some of his colleagues, Zhou Enlai, Liu Shaoqi, use it to slightly slow down the pace of collectivization. It takes Mao 2 months to come up with an answer. In April 1956, he gives a speech to an enlarged meeting of the Politburo entitled "On the 10 Great Relationships." I'm not going to bore you with this speech, but it is a major accomplishment. In this speech, Mao poses as the champion of the ordinary man, a protector of democratic values. He reclaims moral leadership over the party and the communist camp as a whole by outdoing Khrushchev. 2 months earlier, he had looked like an aging dictator, out of touch with reality, clinging to an outdated program of collectivization. Now he, rather than Khrushchev, comes across as the man who strikes the truly liberal tone. A week later, Mao urges the party to accept more freedom among people. He urges 100 flowers to bloom, 100 schools to content. And content people do. We knew that many intellectuals spoke out later on. I'll come to that in a minute. But workers go on strike as never before. Some 30,000 people on strike in Shanghai, a small city like Xi'an, 40 cases of strikes by workers and students. And farmers themselves use this to leave the collectives in droves. Just across the border from Hong Kong, in some of these villages in Guangdong, up to 1/3 of the farmers forcibly take back the land they believe is theirs and start planting crops that they think might actually work a lot better than what they've been ordered to do by the local castes. Still, intellectuals are prudent. They've had about 5 years of thought reform, and many of them have been sent away already to the Gulag. But Mao encourages them in February 1957. Speak out. Be frank. There's a torrent of criticism. Some people compare Mao to the Pope. Many clamor for democracy, human rights. Now demands that the Communist Party actually step down. Mao is stung by the criticism. He's very badly miscalculated. He turns around, puts a tough little man called Deng Xiaoping in charge of a so-called anti-rightist campaign, during which some 500,000 people are labeled as rightists, meaning counter-revolutionary, many of them shipped off to the Gulag. By the end of 1957, every opposition to Mao and the party has been crushed. By 1957, every promise that Mao had made to come to power, like Lenin and the Bolsheviks 30, 40 years earlier, has been broken. Minorities were promised independence. Workers were promised better working conditions. The farmers, the land. Intellectuals, freedom of speech. Entrepreneurs were told that private property would be protected. Every promise has been broken. By the end of 1957, Mao is prepared to start a whole new experiment in communism. It's called the Great Leap Forward. And that's a story for a different day. Thank you.
Having read your book, your previous book, it struck me that Mao truly was, even in the gallery or pantheon of great dictators like Hitler and Stalin, unique in his cynicism, flippancy about human life. And when you have Stalin urging you to be softer on your people, you know that you've got a very unique guy in charge. Well, one person who suffered greatly under Mao, a victim of the 100 Flowers campaign, a man who spent 19 years of his life in the Chinese forced labor camp. I'm very honored to introduce to you is Harry Wu. He was born in Shanghai in 1937 and studied biology in Beijing. During the 100 Flowers campaign, he voiced his opposition to the Soviet crackdown in Hungary in 1956, and also to the social and economic conditions in China at that time. That, of course, led to him being labeled as counter-revolutionary rightist, and he was sentenced to life in prison. He was released from jail in 1979 following Mao's demise. He came to the United States with $40 in his pocket, slept in parks, subways, had a number of part-time jobs, but maintained interest and commitment to speak the truth to the world about the true nature of the Communist Party. He made several trips to China in the 1990s where he secretly recorded images, both video and photo images of the labor camps. And of course in 1992 he established the Lao Gai Research Foundation, a non-profit research and public education organization that is a leading source for information about China's labor camps. In 1995, at which point Wu was already an American citizen, and he tried to enter China with legal documentation, but was imprisoned by the government and sentenced to 15 years in jail. Thankfully, both for him and for us here today, he was immediately deported back to the United States. Harry is a recipient of many international prizes and recognitions for his work on the Lao Gai. And most recently, in 2008, he opened the Lao Gai Museum in Washington, D.C. He is also the Lao Gai Research Foundation director. He is a member of the International Council of Human Rights Foundation and the International Advisory Council of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. Please help me welcome Harry Wu.
First of all, today we are talking about Mr. Dikotter's new book, The Legacy of Liberation. So I want to like to first thank Mr. Dikotter for his tireless work exposing dark history of the Chinese Communist Party. Mr. Dikotter had done as much as anyone to reveal the reality of the Chinese under the Mao, rule of the Mao. So that's talking about what is the real history about 1945 to 1957. 1945, Japanese surrounded, and Chinese began the Civil War. And as he said, the Communist Party got support from Soviet Union. And majorly they're using the Northeast, the Japanese army weapon, and finally defeat the Kuomintang. In 1949, my father was a banker. So we have a pretty good life at the time in Shanghai. We have refrigerator, piano, carpet. Don't feel this is a kind of but in China at that time, this is very high standard of living. And my father had a good friend in Hong Kong, and she was the #1 banker in Hong Kong. But a British friend talked to my father, saying, "You have to leave the country, and because communism revolution coming, and the communism revolution, we understand they're going to destroy two classes. One is landlord class, and the other one is capitalist class." And my father will say, "Well, I'm Chinese. I have to work for my country." And then the British say, "Oh, okay, you want to stay, you can stay, but I want to remove your 2 sons to London to study in there. It means me and my brother." And my father said, "No, my son also belongs to China. I will not pass over my legacy to them, but they are Chinese." But 30 years later, 1980, the British retired, but he came back to Shanghai, and he sent a note to my father saying, "Let's get together." And my father said, "I'm sorry, I can't go there. I have no face to meet my British friend, because I didn't listen to him, and my family were destroyed." My father would later die. He was labeled as a counter-revolution righteous. And my mom was, 20 years ago, 1960s, he committed suicide because he was scared that I was arrested. And my youngest brother also killed by the police because he was suspect that he damaged the wall portrait. Because in the 1970s, probably 100,000 people was executed because they are suspect damaged the wall portrait. But anyway, 2 major classes. One is landlord class, and the other one is capitalist class, finally destroyed. Landlord class, probably 2 million people. Every village have selected landlord class, and right away they were defeated and tortured by the peasants, and right away killed. And all the properties, including the land, divided, give it to the peasants. But until today, you know, every square inch of land in China is owned by the government. That's why the American investor so happy to want to invest in China, because you know the land is owned by the government. It's not owned by the private. So first, landlord class were destroyed, and all their wife and all their daughter were forced to marry with the peasants, and their son. Everybody have a hat, so-called political hat, landlord classes and landlord. Until 1986, the government removed the hat. So probably 86,000 people removed the hat. So now we are qualified as a member of the People's Commune, that's it. But the whole landlord class was destroyed. just like a Jewish, you know. You're 100% of Jewish, maybe you're 50% of the Jewish. Sooner or later, we're sent to the concentration camp. China have a very small capitalist class. And many members of the capitalist class, they love to work together with communist members. But anyway, in 1952, all the classes removed, nobody. So that's why in 1957, I do not have any word or organization or poster, whatever. I was labeled as a counter-revolution righteous. I'm only 20 years old. I'm a boy in the school. I play baseball. I'm the captain of the team. And our team was the champion team of the country. I have a girlfriend, that's it. Because my father was a capitalist, so I am a capitalist member. So I will become a capitalist member, counter-revolution. And the secretary of the Communist Party fired me, and the police come into the classroom and, okay, let's go, sign the paper. Until this moment, until 2013, I do not know what kind of paper I signed. That paper cost me a lifetime to the prison camp. What? The first night in the labor camps, the officials say, do you know about your sentence? I said, I do not know. Oh, he said, all right, okay. The sentence to life. That's it. What is my crime? He said, hey, you're counter-revolution righteous. So you need a life to reform yourself. But you do have to know, this is later, 1957, 1960s. In 1950s, it means Communist Party organized the country on October 1st, 1949. So 2 months later, 1950, the Soviet expert, Gulag expert, we have the name, okay, they came to China. Because China was lack of this experience, set up a labor camp, and Soviet teach the Chinese set up a labor camp. Beijing #1 Laogai detachment was a huge piece of land, swamp land, and today, pretty good. You can drive. In 1991, I drove into the camp with the CBS 60 Minutes at Bradley. And this camp is growing the rice, wheat, and also growing the grapes. The grapes at the time, we 5 kilograms in a wooden box, loaded on a truck, and the truck go to the airport, right away export to Japan. But later, in 1995, 96, I found, oh, they stopped. No, they didn't stop. The grapes will go to the winery. The winery is Carberry what? Carberry's French winery, Raymond Martin. Okay, made a dynasty wine for the National Bank, Chinese National Bank. So this is a very common story. Everyone's supposed, you will understand what it is. And Dikotter remained, people say, today President Xi Jinping, his father was a kind of assistant to Mao Zedong. Okay. And Wu Xilai's father also is a chief of assistant to Mao. Oh, 2 fathers working for Mao, and the 2 sons right now fighting each other. And both of them, when they're teenage, they are rear guards, torture, beating the people, and there was a kind of juvenile program. What's going on? This is Chinese history. At that time, I got the information said, 1958, the Chinese government said, 80 to 85% is criminal, is counter-revolution. Oh my God, how come so many political criminals? Because if you and me, we are both very good relation and we are hungry, and we steal some corn or wheat from the people's commune, we was caught, and if my father was a landlord, whoa, that would become a big problem. They would not charge me as a thief. They charge my behavior as revenge to the people's commune, revenge to the Communist Party, revenge to socialist country, because I'm landlord class. And if your father is a poor peasant, so okay, don't do it, okay, stop, don't do it. Excuse, that's okay. So that is the reason so many counter-revolution. And how they treated prisoners? I cannot say what is my life, what is the whatever, torture, forced labor. I understand I was working in a coal mine, 12 hours a shift, and 30 days a month. That's very common. I can tell you one indication, one information from the government. In 1955 to 1956, so this is in this book, China have a big project, so rebuild the Huai River. They build a lot of dam and a lot of construction work, and draw on like all the two provinces, Zhejiang province, Jiangsu province, and Shanghai municipality, gathering 2 million prisoners participate in the construction with them. Well, everyone say, well, these are bad people. They have to pay back to the socialist country. We did not sympathize them. They have to work, it's okay. But the next year, the president of China, Liu Shaoqi, gathering a conference. Okay, we have to be careful, okay? These prisoners are labor force. We have to keep them alive. Because last year, 2 million people in White River. 1 year later, half of them, 1 million, was died. How they died? I don't know. Maybe starved to death, maybe sick, maybe torture, maybe ever. So we have to save their life because they are labor force. We need the labor force. This is the concept. Until today, still the concept. So that's why in 1990s, see that 60 Minutes, BBC, ABC talking about, and American Congress talking about forced products, importation, whatever. And today there's so many products here made by forced labor. But what else is America doing? The history, sooner or later, have to rewrite it. I think Mr. Dikotter have a big beginning on this issue. For example, I was arrested in 1960, April 27. This is the time for the whole country have starvation, caused 45 million people die. Of course, if the people in the labor camps facing the same situation, but we in Beijing, the Laogai camp, we only saw the people move out, they die. Some people move in, and some people move out every day. But nobody thinking about eating human beings. But only 20-some years later, I heard one report. Liu Shaoqi's wife, Wang Guangmei, Liu Shaoqi's son is the general of military police. They said their father, Liu Shaoqi, have a conversation with Mao. He said, well, eating human beings will cause our 2 our two names on the history book. I said, what is this? And since last year, we had a lot of documents. For example, the first document is Anhui Province Security Department report to the provincial government. Talking about what? 1,289 cases. Cannabis. And many of them eating their daughter. I said, why they don't eat their son? Oh, I want to have my son continue in my family. And I'm sorry, but they kill him. Another document, Gansu Province, they report, very detailed, time, location, the people name, and who they eat. They kill it, or digging the underground, or kill their children. Cannibalism in China, but today you only heard about it. It's nationwide cannibalism. So that's I'm saying, Mr. Dikotter wrote a good book, just as the first one is the beginning to telling the truth.
Thank you, Harry, for a very powerful remembrance of your life in China. Before opening it to Q&A, very quick question for you, Frank. Here's what I don't get. The communists are supposed to be all about re-education, all about molding, creating a new Soviet man, a new Chinese man, or what have you. Why did they assume that capitalist features or landowner features were passed down through generations as though it was some sort of a genetic feature? Why did they target children and grandchildren of capitalists and landowners? Wasn't it a discrepancy in the communist philosophy ideology?
I think it's a very good question. And Harry, in his wonderful speech, just mentioned how, as the son of a capitalist, or the son of a landlord, you could run into trouble. It's a very odd thing that in the middle of the 1970s, I have my microphone on here. I'm having to stand up.
Well, I guess you'll have to compromise this time around and maybe speak to the microphone.
Sure. Let me switch it off then. So it's a very odd thing that by the middle of the 1970s, you would have people born after 1949 and still referred to as landlords. That's their class label. They have no land. In fact, nobody has any land. It belongs to the state. But why? Why are these class designations that are attributed to people in the cities right away in 1949 by the police, as I mentioned, and of course during land reform in the countryside? Why are these class designations inherited? I think it goes back to realpolitik and a very fundamental core value that the communists fear, namely revenge. They realize that when you kill somebody, the son might come back later on and seek revenge. A very important part of the Cultural Revolution, which starts in 1965-66, 15, 16, 17 years after liberation, is of course not just red guards and ideology, but violence in the countryside. When entire families and children are being pushed over cliffs by the villagers. These are not just any villagers. The ones who push others over the cliff are the ones who have benefited in 1949. I got your house, or my father got your house. I lived in your house. Now I'm afraid that your son will come back and seek revenge. I get rid of you, son. This already happened before 1949. There's a wonderful report by Cato where he shows how land reform went wrong in one place, because the farmers gave them a list of people to be eliminated. And Deng Xiaoping says, oh, we eliminated those people, but still the villagers were not happy. They wanted their children and relatives to be eliminated because they feared revenge. the Deng Xiaoping says we went out and we killed all those people too. And still the villagers were not happy. They still feared revenge from others. So they gave us a third list. By that time, of course, the whole region is so bloodied that the whole point of land reform, to have a majority somehow become allied to the Communist Party, has completely failed. So I think that, to me, is the core value here, revenge and fear of it.
Thank you very much. So we're open to Q&A. Please, if you would wait for the mic to get to you, tell us your name, and please be so kind and keep those questions very short so that we can get through as many questions as possible. Yes, sir. Right here.
My name is Stephen Shore. I think the canvas is pretty well known to anyone who knows the slightest thing about the history of China after 49, but you've been invaluable in filling in the details. My question is this. When we talk about Kublai Khan or Hitler or Stalin, they are gone and replaced by successor regimes. The People's Republic is governed by the same Communist Party that in earlier generations committed these millions of atrocities. So are there any policy implications for our dealing with China today?
I work on the past as a historian. I leave the policy implications to the political scientists and social scientists who work on China today. But common sense indicates that the regime today is possibly willing to look at the Cultural Revolution. After all, Deng Xiaoping came to power as the man who promised to end the so-called 10 years of internal chaos. They might even condescend to talking in very indirect terms about the famine from 1958 to 62, but they can't, well, start undermining the very foundation myth of their regime, which is the 1950s, which is being portrayed to this day, and not only to people in public, as the golden age, when things really did work rather well. This is one reason why this period is being overlooked constantly. And the policy implications would be not just the refusal to look at it, but of course, a very simple point that Harry made. These are families. These are families, 100 of them, who have been running the country since 1949. There's no incentive for them to somehow open up the debate or implement political reform. There's no incentive there.
We'll go to the left and then move to the right.
Yes, basically, I'm Pat Spanner, as I myself. Continuing on what you just said, I'm a little confused. You know, the Soviet system, when after 91 they opened up the files, of course I guess Clinton has shut them back down again, but I'm a little confused. Why would the Red Chinese allow you to peruse through these files that documented, that you just said, this golden age, which is contrary, the facts are contrary to what they're trying to put forth?
Thank you.
It's a very good question. There was a lot of pressure after the fall of the Soviet Union by historians in China to have the archives opened up. After all, that is what was happening after 1992 in Moscow. And a law was passed, I believe, a couple of years later, that stipulated that any document which was not too sensitive ought to be made available after a period of 30 years. So the last 15 years I've been working in Chinese archives. The early part of my career was on the period before 1949, but around about 2000, 99, 2000, 2001, I noticed that much greater numbers of documents on the period after 1949 were gradually becoming available. And I think it's fair to say that a reasonable amount is now available to professional historians. I'm not the only ones who work in the archive. There are many local historians who do it, and even a couple of foreigners. Having said that, of course, the key point must be that large amounts of material still remain classified. All of the central government archive, all of the central archives in Beijing are pretty much beyond reach. So that's the real question. if somebody like me can found so much documentation in the early 1950s and greatly forward, what is that we still haven't seen?
My name is Yaroslav Martinuk. And first of all, I want to thank Dr. Dikotter and Harry Wu for very powerful and amazing presentations. My question is for Dr. Dikotter. In the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned that the Americans were dissatisfied with Chiang Kai-Shek. And from my readings, I know that one of the consequences of this was that they stopped the shipments of gold to Chiang Kai-Shek's army, which he was supposed to pay his soldiers, you know. And the reason these gold shipments were stopped is because at that time, the Deputy Treasury Secretary, Henry Dexter White, a known communist agent, intervened and stopped this.
So the question is?
Yeah. If the policy, U.S. policy would have been different, could they have turned things around for Chiang Kai-Shek?
It's counterfactual history. And it's very difficult to answer. Could things have been different? Yes and no. The first thing that has to be said is that Stalin, of course, backed up the communists. This was a Soviet-backed military conquest. And it would have been very difficult for the Americans, indeed, to fight it, even if they had wanted to do so. So the real issue here was not so much Mao. Had he died of a heart attack in 1945, it would have been somebody else backed up by Stalin. The problem was Stalin at the time. He occupied half of Europe, he occupied half of Korea, he occupied all of Maturia. He's the key problem here. And there is another point here, namely that the Americans were disillusioned, is a term I used, with Chiang Kai-Shek, and gradually, I think it's fair to say, abandoned him, imposed an arms embargo in September 1946. They didn't want to fight the fight. But in 1950, they had to do it. In Korea, they were fought to a standstill by Chinese troops in Korea. And then much later on, they had to fight them yet again by proxy in Vietnam. The moment the red flag goes up in Beijing, there are officers from the People's Liberation Army across the border to Vietnam. There are shipments into Vietnam. So surely here the key point is that they couldn't avoid fighting that fight. The Americans, they postponed it, but they eventually had to fight it twice over.
Yes, ma'am. And then we'll go to the right here in front, the lady here.
This is a reporter from the Voice of America, and I haven't read the book, but I think the book will be revealing to the cruelty of the Communist Party, and I think most of the Chinese families can relate to it. And one of my father's uncle actually was executed at that, during that period, the period you mentioned in your book.
Yeah.
Okay. But I'm more concerned about the current China with the crackdown on the web, on the internet, and with the ideology campaign. So my question is for Mr. Harry Wu and for you. So what do you guys think China is heading to now? Thank you.
Where is China? The question is, where is China heading now?
Well, I wish I could answer that one, but as I said earlier on, it's hard enough just being a historian and finding out what happened in the 1950s, not to mention China today. But I did write a very brief piece for the Financial Times about a week ago, pointing out that there are uncanny parallels between what is happening in China today and the 1950s. When Xi Jinping today talks about flies and tigers in his anti-corruption campaign, flies, meaning smaller cases of corruption, tigers, the big ones, when he puts on trial people very high up for corruption, there's a direct reference to the 1952 campaign I just described earlier on. But the uncanny sort of resemblance must also be that under cover of a few highly publicized cases in 1952 and today, there's a clampdown on ordinary people. There's a rectification campaign. People being arrested in 1952 and sent to camps for thought reform today are being arrested for having expressed an interest in democracy on the web. So, again, there are very uncanny parallels. I don't think it's just a coincidence. This is all, after all, a one-party state. There's only that many strategies, techniques of power at its disposal. So when Xi Jinping says about a year ago that China will always be red, I think we have to take him at his word. It doesn't mean red in the sense of communist ideology. It means red in the sense that power is not about to be shared with anybody else.
In the back, Andre.
I really don't get it. The questions. Why Chiang Kai-Shek considered Maturia so important and why he has continuously sent troops over there? And second question, how would you assign weights to external and internal factors in the victory of Chinese communism? How much you would assign to the Soviet intervention, support and so on, and how much to Mao and communists themselves?
Well, the second question is easier. No Stalin, no Mao. The support didn't just come in 1945 or 46 or 47. The support came very much from the very early days in the 1920s, when Mao travels to Shanghai to attend one of these founding conferences of the Communist Party. He goes with Soviet funds. So that one seems to me to be easy to answer. The first one is more difficult. Why does Chiang Kai-Shek insist on capturing Manchuria? Well, of course, Manchuria, you don't have to be a great specialist of Chinese history to realize that the Manchus come from Manchuria, and the Manchus went through the Great Wall of China in 1644 to establish a new dynasty. Now that Great Wall of China may have been more or less great in the 17th century, but it's not about to be large enough to fight communist troops from the north. In other words, strategically, Manchuria is absolutely important. You simply can't hold on to Manchuria and then establish, if you wish, a defensive line along the Great Wall. It wouldn't work. But the other point is that Manchuria is the industrial powerhouse of China. That's where the coal comes from. That's where the wood timber comes from. That's where the soil is rich, black. Manchuria is enormously important as an industrial powerhouse.
Vijay Nilekani. Are your books available in China in Mandarin for the common reader? And the other question is, it looks like the violence that Mao inflicted on his people is many, many times more than what the Japanese inflicted on the Chinese. Not to understate it, but it looks like they can still deploy a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment in China, and I would have thought the same people should be really very, very upset with what happened. I don't know whether these books are available to the average Chinese in Mandarin.
Yes.
Thank you.
The first volume, Mao's Great Famine, was translated in Hong Kong and is available at the Hong Kong airport and elsewhere. Visitors from the mainland on their way back frequently buy everything that is forbidden and take it back with them. I have no doubt that there are versions that can be copied, pirated, downloaded, shared, etc. in the People's Republic. I've had second-year students in history try to find me in the archive because they had a pirated copy and wanted to speak to me about it. This one has not been translated yet. revenge was a key value, but of course the communists deliberately create a fractured society in 1949, and they keep on creating a fractured society. It was very difficult to see an end to that violence, resentment, seething anger. Although, of course, today is a very different period from the 1950s. There are no millions dying to death, and many were poor. There are no people being executed in the tens of thousands. I believe it's only thousands. The scale is very different, but ultimately there is a lot of seething anger there. People don't have any redress. They can't voice anything but through violence.
Okay, we have time for one or two questions. So both in the back. Let's deal with those two.
Hi, thank you. My name is Si Chao. I'm a Chinese citizen. I'm currently studying in the United States. So, Professor, I wonder if you have done any comparison research. For example, compare the China Revolution in the 1950s with China's previous dynasties in Chinese history. Because we all know that when in Chinese history, whenever a new dynasty came into power, there were always people being killed, and there was always like a very big revolution. So do you think the China Revolution in the 1950s is a single isolated case, or it's also based on China's traditional culture? Thank you.
It's a very good question. When we hear the term revolution, we tend to think instead of the violence. After all, the French Revolution was followed by terror, the Bolshevik Revolution was followed by terror. But if you just go back about 100 years from now, back to say 1912, there was a revolution that took place. The Qing dynasty fell. There was no violence except against some of the bannermen working for the Manchus. It wasn't exactly a peaceful revolution, but certainly nothing compared to what happened after 1949. And that revolution very much ushered into an age of openness. To use the title of a book I published some 5-6 years ago, China Before Mao, The Age of Openness. The 1910s, 20s, 30s in particular are marked by much greater diversity and political participation and openness in the economy, openness in allowing people to travel. It's a period that has been very much maligned, of course, by the communists, has suffered from a very bad press. But it's important to bear in mind that when the communists come to power in 1949, they are not just somehow ending 4 or 5 decades of corruption, peasant immiseration, and economic collapse under the Republican regime. They're ending an extraordinary experiment here in globalization and openness. There are more students as a proportion abroad advancing higher degrees, pursuing higher degrees in around about 1934-35 than there are today. There are more specialists in everything from avionics to zoology in the 1930s in China than there are today. That's a really important first half of the 20th century that is frequently overlooked. And that revolution, I believe, was not a violent one.
Thank you. My name is Matthew Robertson. I write for the Epoch Times. Could you talk about, I mean, the broad contours of this history are pretty well known. They've been written about a lot. And yet you wrote a book on it and did an enormous amount of research. What do you feel that that you've brought to new, and that, you know, the reason that you did this? You know, what, you know, analytical points or you know, what are you telling people here with this?
Yes. To be what is new, you have to see that, as I've stressed, I think at least twice, I work as a historian. And as a historian, the fact that one can now gain access to a limited but nonetheless extraordinary range of material in the archives allows one to do social history as opposed to what we've had so far, grand narratives based on the top leaders that use not so much detailed archival evidence, but policy statements, official documentation made available by the regime itself. To me, the great point about this book, and Mao's Great Famine, is that we can really go back and see what happened to people of all walks of life. We can give them a name. We can follow the fates of some of those individuals. We can give it a human and humane dimension rather than reduce it to some policy statement or a debate about the politics of the period. In other words, what am I trying to do? I'm trying to put the history of the people back into the history of the People's Republic. The question for me was, where are the people in the People's Republic? Where are their voices? What happened to them? Why must all these debates, historical or otherwise, always be about whether or not grain production increased in 1953? That's for me the key point.
Thank you, Frank. Please join us upstairs for lunch. Thank you for coming.
Excuse me, can I ask you?
Yeah, he will stand sign and there's lunch upstairs. Oh, and 5 o'clock.
Spain.
Oh, yes, yes, yes. Just Kate.
Wonderful review of your book, Dikotter.